rate setting, and that's specifically on benchmarking, and it's comparing rates or benchmarking rates as well as financial performance. Rate setting, as you all know, is a really broad topic, and we do workshops that last more than a day on just the topic of rate setting. And we've done a lot of webinars specifically on, designing a rate structure that meets your objectives, and a lot of other things related to how to set rates, especially for small water systems. But I'll focus today on benchmarking. It sounds like there might have been some interest in that in the past as well from this forum. Quick broader introduction. If you're not familiar with the environmental finance centers, I want to give you just a little bit of a preview of what we do so that you know that we are available as a resource. We're actually working with GFOA on a big national project helping small water systems across the country looking at finance and rates. The Environmental Finance Center here at UNC is one of 10 centers across the country, all of them called EFCs, and we all focus on different aspects of helping local governments and other organizational providers who are providing environmental services. We help them figure out how to do that in fair, equitable, financially sustainable ways. So we do that by doing a lot of direct assistance and advising. So a lot of small towns would call us up and ask us for, not even small towns, but even large systems too, would call us up for advice, and we would provide a lot of direct assistance. We do a lot of trainings and webinars, and we do a lot of applied research as well that feeds into our trainings and our advising as well. We've been, the EFC at UNC, the University of North Carolina, has been active since, well, for about 20 years now, and I've been here for 15 of those years. I've been working on water and wastewater rates and finance ever since then. So seen a lot from small systems. I've worked a lot with larger systems as well. The national project that I mentioned is one that I've been heavily involved in, and we're working with GFOA, other environmental finance centers, as well as NATO in providing services to water systems that are serving 10,000 people or fewer. And we provide direct assistance and training for those systems for free at no cost to the system. So a lot of towns would call us up and say, we need some advice on reviewing our rates, for example, or can you tell us if we're doing well financially? And we have staff here who's available to work one-on-one with those systems. So I just want to put a plug in for that, because some of you may be working for small water systems, or if not, you may know of small water systems that might be seeking that kind of assistance as well. And just letting you know that we are available as a resource. Here's my contact information. Please feel free to contact me after this webinar if you have any follow-up questions that we don't get to during the webinar. I'd like to know very briefly, actually, from you all, if you, actually, I don't see the polls right now. Michael, if you can pull up the poll real quick. I'd like to know how many systems here are serving fewer than 10,000 people, or between 10,000 and 20,000, and more than 20,000 people. And I'm sorry, Michael, I don't think I can see.
I'm not going to be able to do the poll for at this point right now. Once we've already got started, we're going to have to go gloss over that and go back at the end of the presentation if we're going to do it now.
No worries. I'll ask. We can ask that later on as well. Can you all still see my screen? Michael, can you see my screen?
The screen is through. No one else has reported any issue.
Thank you. I just lost the WebEx platform. I know I'm on it, but I can't see the rest of it. So I'll ask that question a little bit later on. Under rates reviews, when you are all looking at your rates every year, I know there's a lot of things that are being considered when you're sitting around the table and reviewing your water rates. And by the way, when I say water rates, I really mean water and wastewater, because a lot of systems are combined, but I'll just shorten it just by saying water rates. So there are a lot of questions that you have in mind. First and foremost, like, are the rates going to be sufficient to cover all of our costs next year? And then there are questions about what does that include? Are we following state laws? Are the rates appropriate for our customers? Are we splitting the revenue generation between customer classes appropriately? There are a lot of questions that we can do trainings on each one of these aspects of it. But one in particular is this question here on the right, which is, are our rates comparable? And the reason that comes up, because a lot of you report to elected officials or to a council or to a governing body that ultimately have to make the decision whether or not to raise water rates. And a lot of times they ask questions about how are rates comparable to other towns as well. Back in 2014, we did a national survey with ICMA, and we had about 1,400 water and wastewater utilities responding, and we asked questions about how do staff and governing boards work together, communicate with one another in the times when utilities are asking for rate increases. So we asked about what's being presented to the board, what the board finds useful, what other information are they looking for. And from that survey, we found that 94% of the staff that presented to the board said that 94% that they provided information about the utility's financial condition, which is not a surprise. Hopefully everybody would be providing some of that. 74% of the utilities also shared what nearby utilities are charging. So there's a large number of systems out there who are comparing rates already. And 58% also provide similar information about similar size utilities and how much they're charging. And that information was considered by the staff to be very or somewhat useful in their presentations to the boards. So the majority of the systems that we surveyed said that we compare rates for the elected officials. And 62% of the utilities also said that they do this comparison internally. They're the ones who are going out there looking at other utilities' rates and trying to provide that information or collect that information so they can provide to the board. So there's a lot of that that's already happening on the ground. And the elected officials on the other side of the table are interested in it. So that survey, we had 315 elected officials respond to the survey, and they said these are the factors that, amongst other things, are very important or important factors in deciding whether or not to raise rates. 97% said that the financial condition is important. That makes a lot of sense. 51% said that what nearby utilities are charging is important or very important in whether or not that particular utility raises rates. So the majority of the system said that we may or may not raise rates based on what other neighboring utilities are charging, as well as what other similar size utilities. They also mentioned a lot of other factors that were important, one of which is what the affordability is for the residential customers, as well as commercial and industrial, but really the residential ones is very important for a lot of systems. About 92% of elected officials said that affordability for residential customers is important, which requires you to compare rates not just to other utilities rates, but to income levels and to other kind of information about your customer class. So there's a lot of need for it. There's a lot that's happening right now in terms of benchmarking rates. And we recognized that about 12 years ago, and we started doing things to try to improve the way these comparisons and this benchmarking of rates takes place. Here's an example of a utility that posted on their website the result of benchmarking rates in their state. They were very proud of the fact that their rates compared to 63 or so utilities across the state comes out to be the third lowest in the state. And I mean, you can say rightfully or not so, it's up to you, but they were bragging of the fact that they have really low rates. And that's the message that they're trying to share with their customers, that, hey, we're comparing rates, we are doing great because we're charging the lowest in the state. And that's a little bit dangerous. And this is the way that typically we've seen benchmarking rates and rate comparisons happen amongst utilities, especially if you're doing it on your own and you have to go out and collect rates. What ends up happening is utilities would contact several other utilities or would look on their websites and find 10, 15, maybe 20 utilities. And they could be nearby utilities, they could be utilities of similar size or type across the state. But it's a handful of utilities, and they would find out how much they're charging for a specific consumption amount. In this case, I think it's 5,000 gallons. It doesn't show up on the graph, but this is the bill for 5,000 gallons for water for residential customers. And they would put it together into a table, into a spreadsheet, into a graph that looks like this, and present this to the board and say, we are the town, or we are the city of Sanford, we're charging this much, we are, you know, the 12th or the 13th highest or lowest from the utilities that we're comparing to. This table, or this graph actually, sorry, is one of the largest that we've seen. Typically what we see is a graph that includes only about 10 or 15 utilities. So it's dangerous to do this, to have this one graph that shows what everybody's charges are and where you rank amongst all the others. And the reason is, let me go back to the slide. The reason is because if you're presenting this to the board, the only thing that you want to see here from what you're showing is that you want to be on the right-hand side of this graph. You want to be amongst the lowest charging utilities. There's no other information that you're sharing with the elected officials here besides how much you're charging. And the pressure and the incentive in this case is to be amongst the lowest. There's no reason why you, by looking at this one graph, that you'd want to be on the left side of the graph and charging some of the highest. So there are some things that are inherently challenging when you're doing these kind of comparisons. One is that you're comparing utilities that may not be similar in type or in treatment or in capacity. So you might be looking at a system that's twice as big or 4 times as big as you are, and they're charging lower rates than you because they have a larger customer base that they could split their costs on. Or you could be looking at, you're comparing your groundwater system's rates with a water system that's treating surface water, and they have higher costs, for example. You can be comparing only to a few utilities. Like I said, most of the times we see about 10 or 15. And that might not be large enough of a sample to really make comparisons useful. You could be comparing only a one bill amount. So looking at this one graph, you might look like you're doing well or you're charging lower than everybody else at 5,000 gallons. But if you recomputed this at a different consumption, let's say 0 gallons or 2,000 gallons, you might be different, you might rank differently as well. So there's a lot of information that's being lost by just focusing on one consumption point. And then you're not comparing with anything else. You're not looking at how your finances are doing, for example, or the reasons behind why the rates are the way they are, or how your rates compare to the income levels of your community. So when talking about affordability assessments. So it ignores a lot of other information that you need to use to make good benchmarking decisions. And as a result, the board might look at this one graph and say our rates are high enough because ranking to everybody else, we're higher than a lot of other systems, or our rates are lower than towns A, B, and C, and we're happy with that. We don't want to raise our rates to be any higher than those utilities. So that's the only decision point that they get to see from this information. So what's the solution? The solution is to provide a lot more information, and we've done this in the past. We've done rate surveys in several states where we've had 95% response rate. So we're talking about 500 to 600 utilities participating in our rate surveys in each state that we work in. We don't do all states, but in the ones that we do work in, we get about 500 or so utilities participating. And we produce tables of data for you all, for finance officers to be able to download and analyze. And we're talking hundreds of pages of data. And you could use that information. You can share that with your elected officials, but I really don't recommend that approach. Sharing a lot of information could be very confusing. So how do you bring all this information together? We've created dashboards of data. And these dashboards include a lot of information that you typically use for comparison, so looking at how rates compare to other utilities, but it also includes other information as well that's important for elected officials to know at the same time. So that's the key thing here. Even if your state doesn't have a dashboard, if you're doing your own comparison, the key thing is you want to share information that's relevant, which means if I want to compare rates or benchmark my rates, I want to show that against similar type utilities, similar size utilities, and a large enough sample that our comparisons actually make sense. We want to share a lot of information that's also important to know at the same time. So I'm not just going to share how our rates compare, but I need to know how our performance, how our financial performance metrics look like, so that we can tell a greater story, a bigger story than just do our rates look low or high relative to others. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to demonstrate how these dashboards work. So you can go to our website, and when you go under resources on the utility financial rates dashboards, you'll find all these states in blue. These are the ones that have dashboards. Some of them are more current than others. Let me pull up, for demonstration purposes, North Carolina specifically. So these dashboards are available. They're available for free for any of the utilities in the states that are shown in blue. And you would go in here and select your utility. So let me go ahead and pull out OWASA, which is the utility that serves our area here, and the water that I'm actually drinking right now during this webinar. So you pull up your utility, and you can see on this map of North Carolina where you are. We can compare your water bill, your sewer bill, or your water and wastewater combined at any consumption point. So we're starting off at 5,000 gallons a month, but we could lower that to anywhere from 0 to 15,000 gallons a month. So you can pick different consumption points, and it gives you, so you can see right there, OWASA has, when you look at the base charges, you can see that the needle goes to the left, which means that they're lower than a lot of other systems. But then when you look at higher consumption amounts, their needle switches to the right-hand side, which means that they're charging more than a lot of other systems. So this shows you that they're charging relatively low on the base charge and relatively high on the volumetric rate. Let's go back to 5,000 gallons. So when you step back and take a look at this dashboard, the things that typically come to mind or comes to the eye first are the map, which hopefully is self-explanatory, and then 4 dials with greens, reds, and yellows. Hopefully everybody can probably quickly tell greens are probably going to be a good thing, reds are going to be a bad thing, and yellows are somewhere in between. We've got 4 different comparisons happening at the same time, but it's not overwhelming. We're not providing, lots of tables. We're providing 4 pieces of information that are important for an elected official to know. How the bills compare, which is what they're asking for, what the financial condition of the system is, how do the rates compare to the income levels, and I can do a whole webinar on percent median household income. I'm not really in favor of it. There are a lot of problems with it, but it is a factor. It is one indicator that some systems use, so it's on the dashboard. And then another piece of it, which is what's the marginal price, what's the volumetric rate at a high consumption point. So if you're concerned about conservation or providing incentives to be efficient in your water use, marginal price at, let's say, 10,000 gallons a month is an indicator of what you're trying to incentivize your customers to do. So you have 4 pieces of information here, and quickly you can see that OWASA is charging somewhere near the median relative to all these other blue dots that you see on this map. Their cost recovery is pretty good. They're in the green, yellow area. They're definitely above the red area, so that's a good sign. And we'll talk a little bit about these ratios later on. The median affordability, their percent MHI for water and wastewater combined at 5,000 gallons, that $85 that they're charging. And I should say this is information that rates as of 2019 or January 2019. Rates have gone up since then, and we're actually working on updating this dashboard for North Carolina. But as of 2019, that $85.20 was 1.52% of the median household income of Chapel Hill Town. And the conservation price was $17.77 per thousand above 10,000 gallons, which is on the high side. So they're incentivized more so than other utilities in this map. They're incentivizing, or they have high volumetric rates, which is an incentive for customers to conserve and to be efficient in their usage. So we talked about, when you're making comparisons, you need to be comparing similar utilities to one another. So right now we're comparing against 387 rate structures across the state that have water and wastewater information. If we want to compare against similar size utilities, you select that as a comparison group, and automatically the map will filter to the systems that are similar in size. So in terms of, for OWASA, it's between 10 and 25,000 accounts. You can see them on the map, and then the dials will change. At least the top two dials will change because they're related. They show you what these other utilities are charging as well. In the comparison, right now it looks like OWASA is actually charging amongst similar size utilities. They're charging amongst the highest. And what you'll see here is that we don't emphasize low rates equals good, high rates equals bad. In a lot of cases, low rates equals really bad if you're not doing well financially. Ideally, what you want to see is you're doing well financially, you're investing in your system, you're spending the money that you need to spend, and you still maintain rates. It's really hard to do that. But what we show here is when you're comparing against utilities, you want to be somewhere near the median or near between the 25th and the 75th percentile, because then you'll know that your rates are not completely out of whack or are being an outlier relative to other similar type systems. If you're in the really high area, the top 10%, you're shown in the yellow here, or if you're in the really low area, the bottom 10%, we're showing the yellow area just as a caution of, hey, are you sure that you're charging the right rates, or are you charging maybe too much, or is there a way for you to offset this? So for right now, OWASA looks like they're charging relatively high, relative to other similar size systems, but they can also filter by different characteristics, like looking at your own watersheds, or looking at systems that are only serving or only treating surface water. So you can see right there that they're relatively they're still within that median range in their comparison group. One thing that some systems like to do is pick utilities that are nearby. So they're comparing their rates next to their nearby town. So we've built in 25-mile distance, 50-mile distance, and you can do that comparison as well. I don't particularly like comparing to nearby systems because, again, they might be treating groundwater or they might be serving groundwater and you have surface water, or they have a different size system. So the nearness of a utility is not really a good reason or a good justification for why you're benchmarking your rates to them. The only reason why you might want to do that is because elected officials are concerned about raising rates higher than the neighboring town and then having customers complaining that, hey, my neighbors or my friends down the street are paying half as much as we are for water. Why is that? So lots of information available on these dashboards. If your state has a dashboard, you're absolutely welcome to use these dashboards. If your state doesn't have a dashboard, again, the key information or key piece that I want to impart here is that when you're comparing and benchmarking rates, never lose the fact that you need to also be looking at other things too and adding that to the same screen that you're sharing with your board. How are rates doing? How are our finances doing? How do our rates kind of compare to the income levels? And what happens if you raise rates? So let's go back to comparing similar size utilities. Or actually, let's go to all utilities. If the OWASA board says, well, what if we raise our rates? You're asking for a 10% rate increase. What does that make us look like? You can slide this slider down to raise your rates by 10%. You can see that the bill will go up by 10% right here. We'll still keep them in that dark green area. Their cost recovery roughly modeled shows an increase because revenues will be higher by raising your rates. And you can see what the effect will be on affordability as well. There are other things that we have on these dashboards, and we'll talk next about financial performance indicators, but I just want to point out that some of these dashboards, we know that sharing 4 data points or 4 to 6 data points is really all you can do without overwhelming decision makers and even just anybody who's looking at data. But there's a lot more information when you're looking at financial performance than just operating ratio or the cost recovery ratio. So there are other opportunities to share these types of gauges and these type of visualizations to show decision makers how you're doing on one specific aspect, but showing more information. So in this case, it's financial performance, and even if they don't care what each of these indicators might mean, they will care that they're in the green as much as possible. So if they see anything that's in yellow or in red, they might ask the staff to explain what this particular dial is showing or why this one's in red. But in this case, if you look at OWASA, and if you don't understand finances, then I can see from here that most of it is in green. So I think that OWASA is doing relatively well on multiple fronts when you're looking at financial performance. Let me switch back to the slides. And I think we went through the presentations and comparisons of different information. These are the states that currently have dashboards. Some of them are older than others. If you're in Colorado, I'm sorry, the dashboard that we have for you is from 2012, and we haven't yet updated it. But we have some that are, about half of those have been updated in the last year or two. And we're currently working on improving or updating some of them as well. The other piece of the second half of this presentation, maybe not half, I think it'll be the second part of the presentation, is looking at financial benchmarks and financial ratios. When we're talking about benchmarking, I think the first thing that people think of is the financial performance of systems, not specifically just benchmarking rates. And I know that I'm talking to you all, and you all are the experts when it comes to looking at your financial information for your utilities and identifying or determining whether or not your system, your enterprise fund is financially viable or sustainable in the long term. So I'm not going to go into details about indicators, but I wanted to point out just a couple of things, especially when it comes to communicating to decision makers as well, or why you would even consider benchmarking these kind of indicators. When you're looking at financial data and you're translating that to indicators, there's a danger of getting into the weeds of what those numbers mean and where it's coming from and what they include or what they don't include. Well, I think when you're presenting to the board or to elected officials, I would recommend taking a big step back and trying to talk about these numbers in a very simple, plain spoken kind of ways, or put it in a phrase of a question that they might ask, and then be able to use the numbers to answer this question. So these are typical or similar types of questions that I'm talking about. Is the utility self-sufficient? There's an indicator for that. Is there, are we able to cover our debt service payments after covering all of our salaries and chemicals and energy and day-to-day expenses? If the customers stop paying their bills, how long can we keep operations going? And can our system meet its short-term obligations? Do we have enough money to pay for the things that we need to pay for in the next few months? And that's the level of communication I think will be most useful in a lot of cases. And there are indicators, and I think some of you probably know these indicators by heart and compute them constantly. But we're talking about operating ratio, debt service coverage ratio, days cash on hand, and quick or current ratio. I'm not going to go too deep into each one of them, but I want to point out what the benchmarks might be. So the operating ratio, we're looking at total operating revenues divided by total operating expenses. Operating expenses includes O&M costs as well as depreciation. We recommend looking at this ratio both ways, including depreciation, excluding depreciation from the denominator here. When you exclude depreciation, so total operating expenses minus depreciation, what this ratio is showing you is the revenues are coming in, are they going to be enough, or were they enough in the past fiscal year to pay for operations and maintenance? Would not include anything for capital expenses. Debt service is not in here, and there's nothing in here about saving money for future expenses or paying cash for expenses. This is just, is the money coming in to pay enough to pay for operations and maintenance, day-to-day expenses? A benchmark for that, the natural benchmark is 1.0. But I think we can all agree that 1.0 is not enough, especially when you're considering the fact that you have a lot of capital expenses or you might have debt service that you also have to pay. So typically we want to see a benchmark that's higher than 1.0 in this case. And what we look at, and it's hard to kind of decide what that number is, but we typically look for like a 1.5 or so. So on the dashboard, when I showed 8 different financial indicators, we have 1.5 and above is green. There's no real hard reason for why 1.5, except that we've seen systems that have 1.5 or higher to have better finances overall and other indicators as well. Now, credit rating agencies do the same kind of analysis, and they might have different thresholds that they use for determining what the ratings are. We're not privy to what those individual thresholds are for individual utilities, but if you have credit rating agencies, I advise that you communicate with them and find out how you could, which indicators are they looking at and what targets should you be looking to try to achieve in order to improve your credit rating. Now, when you include depreciation, you're also looking at, are the revenues enough to pay for O&M expenses, as well as to set aside money for replacement of assets that are currently depreciating. 1.0, again, makes sense as a natural benchmark, but it's not enough, because even if you're setting aside money for depreciation every single year, and you're replacing those assets at the end of their life cycle, according to what the accountants have said is the end of life cycle, you still won't have enough money to pay for the replacement of that asset. Just purely for the fact that the costs going forward to replace an asset are always going to be higher than what they were when you purchased them 20, 30 years ago, and you're depreciating on those values. So 1.0 is not enough, really should be aiming for a little bit higher to at least account for inflation of costs of infrastructure, as well as for the fact that you have other capital expenses that are not going to be captured by depreciation of your existing assets. So you might have expansions or extensions, or you might have new assets that you're bringing in, or replacements that are higher technology or upgrades to technology. So there might be higher costs going forward. So our dashboards show a 1.2 as a minimum threshold there. But again, it's really hard to pinpoint what that benchmark should be. Debt service coverage ratio, if you have debt service, your operating revenues minus your O&M expenses. So after you spend your money on wages and salaries and chemicals and all that, whatever is left over gets divided by what you have for debt service payments, and you want to have at least a 1.2 or higher. And that's the reason why is because the bond covenants will actually specify a ratio, a debt service coverage ratio, and almost always it's 1.2 or something more significant than that. I know a lot of utilities actually aim for higher benchmarks than 1.2. I know some utilities that have a benchmark or a target of 2.0. They want to make sure they have enough revenues coming in, net revenues coming in after paying for O&M that covers debt service twice over. Days cash on hand, looking at unrestricted cash and divided by a daily O&M expense. And that's a relatively easy one to calculate. It's really hard to figure out what the benchmark should be. In plain English, this is if people stop paying you money, how much money do you have available to keep paying for salaries and chemicals and energy and to keep operating your system before you run out of cash? And it computes into that actual number, days cash on hand. So you might calculate 180. 180 means that you have 180 days worth of cash available to keep operating your system without any inflows of revenue. Well, what's the right benchmark? Should we aim for 90 days? Should we aim for 365 days? That one's really hard to determine. If you look at the credit rating agencies and look at the medians of what the best rated utilities are maintaining for this ratio, we're talking in the hundreds of days. We're talking about 300, 400 days, days cash on hand. I think most systems aim for something like 180 days or more. The bare minimum, I would say, it should be 90 days. You shouldn't really have any less than 90 days cash on hand, especially if you're a small system, because your revenues will fluctuate quite significantly depending on your collections or depending on when your billing cycle is. So having 90 days gives enough buffer to cover all of your expenses while you're waiting for the next checks to come in from your customers. And the current ratio is one where you're looking at your unrestricted cash, basically your current assets, and divided by current liabilities, and it assesses whether or not you have enough assets available, current assets available, to pay for what you're liable in the next few months. And a good ratio for that, again, the natural one is 1.0, but it's not enough because this really changes day by day. And when you calculate this at the end of a fiscal year, the next day it might look very different. So the ratio, even though 1.0 is theoretically good, I think that aiming for something like 1.5 or 2 gives you a lot more liquidity, a lot more security against changes in your liabilities or even your assets. We have a whiteboard video that we created that takes everything I just talked about throughout this whole webinar, actually, and put it into I think it's a 10-minute, maybe fewer than 10 minutes, 10-minute video that describes financial benchmarks in terms of a person who owns a car and how they want to make sure that they have enough money to keep that car and to keep that car running going forward. So it's a very simple whiteboard video. It translates everything to very simple terms. It's good for elected officials as well as for staff to use it, and it's available on these links. Hopefully, Michael will be sending the PowerPoint slides to everybody so you have access to all of this.
Absolutely.
Thank you. When we're talking about benchmarking, especially financial ratios, I would highly recommend not looking at just the last fiscal year. So you get all this information from your audited financial statements. You can compute each of these benchmarks easily every single year. I think that the key thing here is that you need to be looking at individually your utility, your enterprise fund, and how those ratios have trended over the past 5 years, 5 to 10 years, but at least 5 years. Because you might look, if you look at this example, everything above the dotted line is good. So at the latest fiscal year 2016, this utility did well in all of the benchmarks, except for maybe this one, they were close to it. So they might have said, all right, well, we did well. We're going to tell our board that all of our financial benchmarks look great, and we're happy. But by stepping back and looking at 5-year trends, you can see a different picture. Yes, they might have been fine this past fiscal year, but all of their financial benchmarks have actually been trending downwards, which tells me that unless they change their practice going forward, whether that means controlling their costs or raising the revenue in some way, then next year or 2 years down the line, these indicators won't look so positive. So trending, looking at your trends and then benchmarking it to a specific target that you want to set is important. And we have a tool that's available, a spreadsheet tool, a very simple tool where you can download, and it walks you through using your financial audited statements, putting in the numbers, copying it from your audited statements into this spreadsheet, and it calculates these graphs for you automatically. So that way you have something available to copy and paste into a report or to share with your board if you want to, or to at least for yourselves to analyze your own data. And you get to set your own targets. So the dotted blue lines get to move up and down based on what benchmarks that you set. We talked about setting targets for these benchmarks for financial indicators in a separate webinar. And I'm happy to answer questions about them. But I wanted to let you know that you could go back and view this recorded webinar, and this was also done for small systems, and take a look and see what was being discussed as far as what kind of benchmarks, what kind of targets to set. But if your utility hasn't already set targets for these financial indicators that we're talking about, or for other financial indicators, then I think that's a good thing, a good strategy for systems, especially small systems that need some help identifying whether or not they're doing well financially and how they can communicate with their boards about their condition. Because if it's a battle every year to go and stand in front of the board and to re-explain how your enterprise fund is doing, then if you and the board can agree on specific targets and say, we want to make sure that our enterprise fund never has an operating ratio less than 1.1, never has debt service coverage ratio less than 1.3, for example, then you could be presenting that information to the board every year. And if there's something that triggers an issue or a problem, or if you hit a specific target or a specific threshold, then you could be going back to the board and saying, hey, we've got this problem, we have this solution, can we operationalize it? So it's a good way to get your board to understand the finances of the system and to be able to see a long-term future and to sleep well at night, essentially, to have a minimum target for your system financial performance. Here's a long list. I'm not going to go over this one. It's a long list of examples of what these financial targets might look like. So you might have debt service coverage ratio of a certain amount, or you might have days cash on hand, minimum of 180 days, or a target for a capital reserve fund. So you can set different targets, and we've seen targets all over the place. There's no one threshold that applies to everybody. I think that it really should be customized for each utility based on what the objectives, the conditions, and what the purpose is of setting those targets for the utility. We won't go into the poll question, but I was going to be curious. You can tell me on the, when you're asking questions, whether or not you actually do any of these, whether you compare water rates to other systems, whether you compare your finances to the budget, or you actually calculate financial performance indicators, and whether you set targets for financial performance indicators. So if we can get
before we get out of Q&A, I'll try to launch that poll again so we can see exactly what we've got there.
Okay. That would be great. I'm wrapping up right now, so I'm opening up for Q&A. But before I do that, just to let you know about some resources for small water systems. You can go on this website, efcnetwork.org, and this is a website where we have all this information, all the recorded webinars we've done, locations of upcoming in-person trainings, as well as people asking for assistance for small water systems. It's really geared for water systems serving 10,000 people or fewer. And you can have, from there, you can look on the resources, you can see the map of our dashboards. You can go on the resources library and find these tools, that, one of which I talked about just now. And then if you click on the assistance and hit request assistance, you can basically sign up a small system to be contacted by us for help. So that's the time I have for the presentations. I'm happy to have answer questions right now.
Fantastic. While I work on getting the polls, this came up pretty quickly, and I think it's it's very important, and as everybody here. So how can we get more states to participate in this, or what efforts are underway to expand this so that more of our members can benefit from this dashboard?
Okay, so for the dashboards, if you go back and you can pull up the map so you can see where we have dashboards. We do this based on available data and based on our connections to states. So for some of the states, we do the rate surveys ourselves, and we will partner either with the states or with the infrastructure funding bank or finance bank for that state to conduct a survey of rates. And we try to do them for each state once a year, but it's not always the case. So North Carolina and Georgia, we do them annually. In Alabama, it's every 2 years. In Arizona, I think it's every 2 years. So in some cases, we have these relationships with the state where we try to do the surveys every year, every 2 years. Other states, we get information either from other partners that have done the surveys, or that we're contacted about creating a survey and creating a dashboard for that state. So if there are states that are not shown in blue here or that have an old dashboard and you think will be really important for your state to have a dashboard, feel free to contact us, and we can look into whether or not there's an opportunity for us to be able to partner with a state agency or somebody else to be able to create a dashboard. Right now, it's not easy for us to go in and just add, let's say, a Kansas dashboard, and we won't do it for just 10 or 15 systems. We definitely need to have a large number of systems in order for the dashboards to make sense because of all the benchmarking points that I mentioned earlier. You want to have good comparison groups, and if you filter down, you need to have still a large number of systems of similar types that you can compare to. So we look to try to build these relationships. If you're interested in dashboards, just contact me, and we can talk about whether or not that might be possible. And we're currently working on a system that will allow utilities to go in and either add or edit their own rates into our database directly. So at this moment, we go in and get the information from your rate sheets and we put it into the database. We're trying to get a system set up so that utilities can go in and add their own utilities and add their own rates. It's not going to be ready this year. It will be a few more months before that system is operationalized. But once it is, then it might be hopefully possible for other states to quickly create new dashboards.
Excellent. We've got a request to ask a question here from Joel Manning. I'm going to unmute you here, Joel, if you want to introduce your locality and how you're at.
Yeah, we're actually very close to the state line, in North Carolina line. I see that the dashboard does South Carolina, North Carolina. We probably have to compare more with towns in North Carolina, given our proximity to them. Will the dashboard work for across state line?
Great question. We've wanted to do that for a while. So right now, the dashboards are only within state lines, but we are trying to work, actually, the New England section, we're trying to create a regional dashboard. And if we get that to work for one place, we will try to apply that across the boards for others. So places where you see several states in blue together, we will try to create that. But right now, that's not yet available. But what you can do is you can go to the North Carolina one. Let me switch back to the dashboard. If you go to North Carolina, and even though you're in South Carolina, you can add a utility. And it's, I think last week this function was not working very well, so hopefully the programmers have it set up. But you can create a new utility and add your own information, and it should pop up. Let me try to go back. It should pop yourself up. You won't see yourself on the map, but you should find the information that you add to this dial. So that way you can see where, how you compare to all the utilities in North Carolina. Now, it won't allow you to choose an area of North Carolina, compare yourself to just that piece of it, but we're working on trying to create these kind of regional dashboards.
Fantastic. One question that came to my mind was, had any exposure to the elected officials as authorities that have been exposed to the dashboard? Have they generally been positively received?
Yeah, so we've been doing these dashboards for at least 10 years. I don't remember exactly when we started. And we've gotten a lot of feedback from both the utilities as well as from elected officials. We were curious to see how the dashboards were being used. We thought initially they'll be used internally by the utilities, but a lot of utilities were actually using this in their presentation to the boards to kind of show the different metrics in their presentation, or they take a screenshot of it and present it in the documents that they give to the board. And they say, they've come back, the staff has come back and said that they find that to be very useful, in the fact that a lot of times they've gone to the boards that have kept refusing to raise rates until they got to see the dashboard and they got to see that not raising rates was detrimental to financial performance. So that extra information, I mean, I can pull up some examples from this, but I won't embarrass anybody. I can give you just an example utility where you can see, that's an affordability issue, that's the wrong one. There are some cases out here where the rates are so low and they're shown in yellow, but their financial performance metrics look terrible. And because of that, they were able to get their board to understand that, okay, we need to raise rates in order to improve the financial sustainability of our system. So there's a lot of feedback from staff saying that, and the elected officials that have talked to us said that they really like how intuitive the dashboard is, and it makes information a lot easier to understand than from tables or graphs in some cases.
All right. Well, what do you think was most difficult about data collection, or what is there a kernel, a useful piece of data that was particularly needed but difficult to get to make the dashboard work?
Well, when we do when we're creating these dashboards and we're doing rate surveys, we've tried different ways, and you know, I'm talking to the finance officers here. So we've called finance officers to get information, and it's been hard because everybody's busy. So what we found to be the best approach is to just ask for the rate sheets. So we call and we get the rate sheets from the utility. It's just an email that they send us. Then we have to understand, we take the rate sheet and we interpret it and put it into the database in a way that it can compute the bill at different consumption points. The difficult part is understanding all the nuances of some of the more complicated rate structures. So if you're going to go out there looking for rates to do your own benchmarking, if there's no dashboard that's already available that's already done that for you, then I would suggest that when you get the rate sheets, I would suggest that you get the rate sheets and take a look at them, but you might have to contact the utility back to understand some of the details, some of the nuances of the rate structure. Other information they find here, the financial performance, that really comes from the audited financial statement. So as long as you have access to the financial audited statements of your utility or of other utilities, that shouldn't be hard to compute what these indicators are. Income levels, like median household income, you can get that from the Census Bureau's websites. If you go to data.census.gov and put in any town's name, you can find the income levels of community. So the information on the socioeconomic indicators for different communities, that's not hard to get. The financial performance of utilities, for at least government utilities, that's not hard to get. It's really getting the rate sheets and understanding what's in the rate sheets in order to compute the bills that we find to be a little bit tricky.
All right, well, that is comprehensive. I could have hoped for something. Any more questions come in? I'm fumbling through the poll here. I just have to send something out via email. And, well, Shadi, as I mentioned before, and as I mentioned to the UFF members some months ago, I've kind of been working on my own project to kind of get demographics figured out for who exactly our finance officers are surveying. So that's information I can get over to you so we can kind of narrow down who exactly may benefit for this from the most. So please ignore my brief screen share there. Any final questions? Any last questions before we move on here? Feel free to send them my way before we bid farewell to Shadi.
And I'm certainly happy to answer questions by email. I'm going to be traveling the next couple of weeks, but send me an email and I'll respond as soon as possible. And we've got, like Michael was saying, we're able to work with systems on benchmarking their finances or benchmarking their rates. We've done, for the states that we have dashboards, some systems call us up and say, can you please work with me to figure out what the message is that we want to share with our elected officials, because we're going to go in for a rate increase or we're going to review our rates with them. And we've done that, where we've reviewed the rates and reviewed what information we have on their dashboards from the financial statements. So all that we can provide for small systems in particular. But I'm happy to answer any questions you have about benchmarking in general.
Well, as always, the UFF here is to serve the entire membership as well as members individually. So should anything come up in the future, like Shadi said, you can contact him directly or myself or Barry McMeekin. Again, we are here to make sure you guys are getting everything you can get out of this. I will be sending this out, this recording of this webinar, that is, along with all of the materials that Shadi has provided us. Take a week or so for the recording to get rendered properly and everything. And as I mentioned beforehand, I'm trying to get these things posted to the GFOA website, so just always have it available there and not have to wait for one of my weekly emails out there. But that said, I want to thank you, Shadi. This was fantastic. I know that everyone that's tuned in, they've enjoyed it quite a bit. There's been a lot of requests for this, and I want to thank everybody who attended. In between the holidays here, I know it can be hard to find the time. I know that I've been a bluster the past 2 weeks myself. So that said, again, thanks to everybody. I hope we stay tuned for the next one. Of course, more information will come over the next couple, 3 months with our next presentation. All questions, ideas for issues to be presented on, please send them my way or to Barry McMeekin. Again, that's what we're here for. So with that, I hope everybody enjoys the rest of your day, and happy holidays.
Thank you.
You can hang on the line there for a second if we want to go over anything after the presentation.
All right. Thank you so much.